is a professor emerita in the Department of History at the University of Victoria. Her publications include Stein, The Way of the River, with Michael Nglonglas, pardon me if I pronounce that incorrectly, Nature Power in the Spirit of an Okanagan Storyteller with Harry Robinson, which won the Roderick Haig Brown Prize for Best Regional Book at the BC Book Awards. Write It on Your Heart, The Epic World of an Okanagan Storyteller with Harry Robinson, which was shortlisted for the Roderick Haig Brown Prize, and Living by Stories, A Journey of Landscape and Memory with Harry Robinson. Her recent book, At the Bridge, James Tate and an Anthology of Belonging, earned second place this year at our Lieutenant Governor's Historical Writing Awards. So may I introduce to you Wendy Wickwire.
Thank you very much. Now I can really see myself. I'm too big. I thank you for inviting me to do this, and I really enjoyed your meeting because it just gives me a sense of where you all come from and what you represent and the great work that you do, and makes me think that our history departments should be more involved in what you do. And I think that will be part of the theme of my talk, which comes from really where I've sat for most of my career, which is in the university doing history. So the title of my talk is Public History Between the Profession and the People. So I finished that book, the biography of James Tate, in the spring of 2018, and then faced a very tough decision. Do I send it to a university press or to a trade press? The former targets mainly the scholarly reader, while the latter the more general reader. On the surface, my manuscript looked like a standard scholarly offering. It was hundreds of pages long with multiple citations throughout. Having struggled for years to turn a mass of dry data into a compelling story, however, I worried that by placing it with an academic press, I might lose many of the readers I wanted to attract, most notably Indigenous readers. In the end, I chose UBC Press with hopes that I could somehow straddle that scholarly trade divide, market divide. 2 years into this process, I now appreciate the challenges and perhaps the futility of trying to straddle that divide. From separate lines of book prizes, literary events, book review outlets, to independent bookstore orders and marketing strategies, the two publishing worlds could not be more separate. If they converge at all, it is most often as adversaries, the trade publishers dismissing the scholarly publishers as too exclusionary and highbrow, and the scholarly publishers dismissing the trade publishers as too popular and lowbrow, especially in my field, history. Such tension, I think, serves as a good segue into the theme of my talk on public history, because public history, I think, in relation to academic history, faces some of the same issues. And first, a confession. Until Andrea Lister and Doug Brigham approached me a month or so ago to give a talk on public history, I hadn't really given much thought to the status of public history. From my perch at the University of Victoria in the history department, I looked on it as the more outward-focused sphere of history, most notably that associated with museums, land claims research, documentary filmmaking, public commemorations, and so on. And I left it at that. My preparation for this talk has been good, as it's forced me to take a harder and broader look at public history. It now has me really wondering about you, my audience, this evening. I wish I could see you all in person. Members of the BC Historical Federation, I'm curious about where you stand in relation to the public academic history divide. How many of you define yourselves as public historians? How many university academics are there among you? What sorts of roles do academic versus public issues play in your federation? And vice versa. I certainly personally appreciate that your book prize gives equal weight to academic and trade books. I think that's really an important thing, and I'm starting to notice the two spheres are just so separate. I so appreciate that yours isn't. But back to my talk. My initial thought was to interrogate the various binaries that turn up in relation to public history. For example, public versus academic, open versus closed, popular versus specialized, amateur versus professional, outsider versus insider, community-based versus ivory tower, even terms like dull versus engaging. With my home institution, along with various other institutions right now across the country, launching new MA programs in public history, some of these binaries, thankfully, seem to be fading. Prominent academics, such as David Dean at Carleton, Peter Satius and Lindsay Gibson at UBC in education, have been advocating for the public side of academic history for some years. Barring COVID restrictions, their initiatives will culminate in March 2022 in Montreal, where Canada will host a major international conference in public history. So a quick survey of the roots for this paper of the public history movement, as I found it was called at the beginning, reveals that it emerged in the 1980s in the United States around a dwindling job market for PhDs in history. And I found this very interesting. I couldn't help but notice that its current fluorescence in Canada, new programs at Western, York, Concordia, UVic, seems so similar. Record numbers of PhDs in history in Canada with no jobs. The country's new public history programs, at least on the surface, promise to offer some relief in the form of new employment niches and maybe teaching jobs for these surplus PhDs. Despite the current university's current embrace of public history, however, my feeling is that public history still sits on the periphery of academic history. Read anything on the topic and the old phraseology continues to surface. Public history is academics' poor cousin. Public history is amateur history. I spotted one definition that paired public history with regular history. Regular history, I thought, what is that? The terminology and pairing sort of evoked to me uneasy images of normal history versus abnormal history. I can't help but wonder if the term public might be causing the problems. Why is it even needed? Related disciplines within the social sciences and humanities, for example, anthropology, archaeology, sociology, they do not need a public academic divide. And especially in this age of fake news, political bias, contested facts, and charges of misrepresentation, manipulation, and misinformation, shouldn't the public side of history simply be what we all do? To help me through this, I contacted Jennifer Bennell. She was one of my former students, but now she's an associate professor of public history in the Department of History at York. Bennell's award-winning social and environmental history of Toronto's Don River, Reclaiming the Don, which is a wonderful book, by the way, U of T Press, 2015, is well recognized for straddling that academic trade divide. I asked Jennifer what she thought of my idea to interrogate the divide between so-called public history and academic history. Well, you could have fun with this one, she said. Then she launched into a lively account of the growing status of public history across the country, highlighting the internet as a major catalyst. More and more historians, she said, especially this new generation of historians, are connecting with wider audiences through the internet and also engaging in companion public history initiatives, such as digital mapping initiatives that make their data accessible to the public. This extends to artists, researchers, and other disciplines who do neat and unexpected things with it. Many of the new guard, she said, are turning to outlets beyond the conventional peer-reviewed journals to podcasts, blogs, e-journals, and she mentioned, and we're all hearing more and more about the websites activehistory.ca and nichecanada.org. The speed with which some of these new online journals and websites are moving is transforming the face of traditional historical practice and institutions. Jennifer co-edits an online peer-reviewed journal, Papers in Canadian History and Environment, and finds that unlike the discipline's traditional journals, this e-journal not only guarantees its authors a much quicker turnaround, it also connects them instantly to massive audiences. The result, Jennifer says, is, quote, a nice example of the public facing of academic history by using the tools of public history. So these new outlets, she explains, are closing the gap between academic and public history by making research data accessible rather than guarding it. A really engaged public history, she says, is one in which the knowledge exchange is a two-way street, i.e. informed by the communities in which one works, as opposed to the old model of the all-knowing historian giving public lectures aimed at disseminating knowledge. Bennell's next comment surprised me. She said, I think historians like you have been operating as public historians through public talks, writing accessible work, writing crossover books with trade publishers, without necessarily claiming that title. Like me, I have actually thought, I hadn't really thought of myself as a public historian, but now that she's mentioned it, well, maybe. I mean, thus far, all of my books have been aimed at the general public, and all but the current one came out with trade publishers. The first one, Stein, The Way of the River, a co-authorship with Michael McGonigal, published with Talon Books in Vancouver in 1988, was written specifically as a political tool to alert the public to the vulnerability of then threatened Stein River Valley. The book was the only method available at the time to get the word out to a broad general audience. Remember, this was before the internet. So books and slideshows, and it's really, I mean, young people just don't get this, were critically important tools of the environmental movement. My later collaboration with Okanagan storyteller Harry Robinson, 3 books of oral narratives in the late 80s and early 90s, was a response to his desire to get his historical perspective out to the general public. White people, he said, need to hear these stories. I remember worrying in the mid-1990s as I was coming up for tenure at UVic that the public orientation of such books might actually block my tenure application. I recall hearing my colleague Douglas Cole at SFU express similar concerns at this time, same time, about his research on the history of anthropology and museum collecting on the Northwest Coast, clearly pioneering work in public history, because he felt that such subject areas did not fit neatly into the accepted norms, research norms within his SFU history department. In his introduction to his book, a wonderful book, Captured Heritage, The Scramble for Northwest Coast Artifacts, published by a trade published, by the way, Douglas and McIntyre, he took a stab at his colleagues. The book, he wrote, quote, was written by a professional historian aiming at the quite impossible task of satisfying his peers. I recall giving a paper in Vancouver in the early 1990s on the Tlakatlak memories of first contact in their territory, and a colleague, a highly respected university-based historian, challenging me on grounds that my evidence was not only thin, but unreliable. How could I prove, he asked, that those elders were not reading the primary sources? In this case, Simon Fraser's journal, and one of the elders couldn't really speak English well and could not read English at all. Another colleague advised me against sending the article to the Canadian Historical Review. She felt its reliance on oral sources did not fit the parameters of the journal at that time. In fact, the CHR was interested in the piece, and they did publish it in 1994. I think my timing was good because the CHA was beginning to change direction in 1994. 2 years earlier, it had broken from tradition and awarded Julie Crookshank the top prize, the best book in Canadian history, for her Life Lived Like a Story, UBC Press. It was a monumental move, as Crookshank was an anthropologist, not a historian, and her book was based entirely on oral interviews, the life history of 3 Yukon elders. So I was fortunate to arrive at UVic's history department in 1995 because it was one of the first history departments in Canada to embrace the change. One of John Lutz's first projects after arriving at the department in the mid-1990s was the launch with his University of Saskatchewan colleague, Keith Carlson, one of the country's first ever history field schools in collaboration with an Indigenous community, in this case, the Stalo. Another Lutz initiative was a website project with his colleague, another historian, Ruth Sandwell of Oise, The Great Unsolved Mysteries in Canadian History, aimed at the country's social studies curriculum. For John, such initiatives were never short-lived fads. He has stayed on this course for close to 3 decades. It is no accident that UVic's public history MA materialized during his tenure as chair, whereas most of Canada's university-based historians would have winced at some of his public history initiatives as too far out of the box. His colleagues at UVic welcomed them. It certainly helped me, because when I turned up at UVic in the mid-1990s proposing courses like oral history, Indigenous history, and the history of anthropology and museums on the Northwest Coast, no one blinked an eye. By the early 2000s, the tide, thankfully, it really shifted. Many history departments across Canada raced to fill what they saw as gaps in their offerings. Gaps such as gender history, Indigenous history, colonial history, environmental history, and on and on. Along with this were calls for increased engagement with public history and more emphasis on collaborations with the communities under study. This spawned an explosion of new work in Indigenous history. Keith Carlson's co-authored book with the Stalo, You Are Asked to Witness, immediately comes to mind, but the list is long. Cole Harris, Jean Barman, Robin Fisher, Paige Raybmon on Indigenous history, Adele Perry, new work on gender, Mary Ellen Kelm, the history of Indigenous health, Pat Roy on the history of Chinese and Japanese in BC, which is just in the last 5 years exploded, but she was so early on that path. With university-based historians Arthur Ray, Hamar Foster, Bob Galois, and others serving as expert witnesses in prominent BC land claims cases, such as the one that was just mentioned, the Delgamuke case, the discipline gained more public profile than it had ever had. And these historians are still at it. And interestingly, I'm looking at this as quite interesting. Some, such as Cole Harris and Jean Barman, have moved into the trade publishing sphere via Howard White at Harbor Press has done so much. Paige Raybmon has taken UBC Press in a new direction with the recent release of the oral interviews of Sliam and Elder Elsie Paul's life story by its new press side project called Raven Space. So yes, the good news in 2020, I would say, is that the gap between academic history and public history seems to be closing. This is partly due to the country's university-based public history programs, as I just mentioned, which are graduating historians who are more committed than ever to the public. But it's also due to historical organizations like yours, who, along with the local museums and archives across the province, and trade publishers like Harbor, Douglas and McIntyre, Ronsdale, Touchwood, who are also committed to the public side of our history. Credit is also due, I think, to the large mass of frustrated PhDs and their efforts to create new non-university-based outlets to disseminate their work and to air their grievance about their grim employment situation. All of this activity is making it more and more difficult for academic historians and university publishing houses to proceed along their traditional path, writing and publishing esoteric books aimed at small circles of specialist readers with often little regard for general readers or the public or the sales potential of their books. Many university historians these days are trying to break through this stereotype. Antoinette Burton, University of Illinois, one of the leading cultural historians in the US right now, complained recently in the introduction to her book, which a lot of you would find quite interesting if you already know about it, called Archive Stories. She wrote that, quote, academic history does so little to capture the popular imagination and even less to make people outside the university care about it. A big problem, according to Helen Sword, author of a very exciting new book, which I found inspirational, on academic writing, trying to sort of help with style in academic writing. She complains that the lack of training among academics in the art of storytelling is a big problem. Hence, in the social sciences and humanities, an over-reliance on what she writes as wordy, wooden, weak-verbed academic prose, often with the best stories buried under layers of abstraction and critical theory. Kate Brown, an award-winning academic historian in the US who came to UVic for a visit, was just, for me, at the perfect time when I was sort of struggling with my own writing, gave a talk which I found inspiration, and she would agree with Sword, the previous author I mentioned, on this point. Brown sees history writing as a genre that, whatever its focus, should be enjoyable and interesting to read. How else would or will our work be widely read and discussed, she asks. So in this age of pandemic, fake news, authoritarian politics, and social movements such as Black Lives Matter, Brown's appeal is ever more important. As McGill-based historian Jason Opel explains, the discipline of history is now so much more than university teaching and academic publishing. It's, and I quote him here, a high stakes conversation with the past, an all-out search for perspective on the human drama that is unfolding all around us. Indeed, there has never been a period more in need of historical awareness than right now. We can no longer luxuriate in self-referential writing projects. One of the big issues we face right now is how to deal with fake news when everything fake is so easily manipulated by the social media that it can easily convince, as we're seeing, the public of its truth. Of all professions, history, I would say, even though I'm totally biased, is best equipped to deal with this. Historical analysis will show that there's nothing new about fake news. It has a long history of mobilizing fraudulent stories to promote wars and corrupt systems of colonization and oppression. Drawing on the historian's toolkit, 1, a careful attention to detail, 2, a dutiful checking of sources, along with 3, a strong application of an analytic intelligence, historians can help the public understand and evaluate the manipulative power of the media. So, when confronted, as we are right now, across the continent, in our country, in our province, with statues of John A. Macdonald, Captain Cook, Judge Begbie, the historian might use these statues to help the public understand issues of racism, oppression, and nation building, some associated with these statues, some not, rather than smashing them in knee-jerk reaction to the ground. To return to the issue of the academic-public divide, both in the scholarly and publishing spheres with which I opened this talk, I suggest eliminating both academic and public as adjectives as a way to break down this academic-public divide. The goal should be to highlight the importance of the public in all of our historical endeavors. Unless our histories on both sides of this binary engage with the wider public, then why do it? If an adjective is needed, why not something like a critically informed history? With the world confronting new crises by the day, such phraseology might do much to breathe life and relevance into a history for the present. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Wendy Wickwire's Mark Forsyth here, and I've been asked to direct some questions to you from people who have been listening. You've made us think of so many different things in your talk, and if people do have a specific question for Wendy, you can send it through chat right now. And in fact, she has kindly offered a copy of her book, her award-winning book. And we're going to draw for this a little bit later and send that off in the mail. And all you have to do is go to the chat function and send us a specific question. And lots of inquiring minds there, I know. So please do fire us a question. And I'll just toss one your way about this academic public divide. What are some of the challenges, do you think, in having people go in either direction, having academics communicate more effectively with the public? So that, and you did touch on this in your discussion, but there are challenges taking sometimes very complex historical research and framing it in a way that the rest of us can understand. So how do people in your academic community begin to do that?
Well, that's a good question, Mark, and that's certainly what I faced, because, you know, I am really tackling my own crew with this paper and this perspective. And we really are, we have had the luxury to sort of write whatever we want and whatever we want. And we are sort of reared in an academic style of writing on this side of the equation. And I think that for writing this last book in particular, I just wanted to reach a broad audience, and I really wanted to reach an Indigenous audience. So I started paying attention to people like Kate Brown, who were really advocating for academic writing. Why can't our academic writing projects, as complex as they are, why can't they be written in such a way that they can reach a broader public? It might take a bit longer, that's the problem. But I think that so long as we're sort of restricting to, you know, to these small little inside groups of specialist readers, that we're not doing a favor to ourselves or our profession. And even listening to you talk tonight, your group, I just kept thinking, you know, the university needs to be more tuned into what you're all doing. You know, the students should be connecting to your group. And I really do think that we, on this side of the public academic equation, we really need to be responding to writing for larger audiences. You know, we can take complex stuff. We should be able to take complex ideas. I had lots of theoretical stuff that I really wanted to lay on that last book. I sort of tried to figure out ways that I could leave or really satisfy the academic and the reader who is looking for some theoretical grit, but also not lose my general reader.
I guess we as heritage organizations in the province, we can become another platform for sharing that and encouraging the academic community and writers to share through our organizations as well. And I want to get to the questions actually that people are now posing to you, Wendy, which is great. Janet Nicol, here's one. Great talk. Thank you, Wendy. I think having a thesis has been part of the divide. Can good critical history not necessarily have a thesis?
Well, that's an interesting question. I personally think that all writing, all scholarship needs, on both sides of that equation, needs a thesis. A thesis is just a good question, a good problem. I personally don't work very well unless I'm sort of pushing and figuring out a problem. If I'm just sort of veering off into sort of abstract description, that makes it a little harder to and if you're going to get a good story out, I think you should lose sleep over it until you sort of figure out the problem is such a motivational thing for the author and for the reader. So I think a thesis is really important. Sometimes I think the word thesis and dissertation and thesis gets people, the dissertation gets people thinking, it has to be too academic. That is loosening up, I think, has to loosen up.
I'm guessing there's been a two-way flow after At the Bridge came out. I'm wondering if people who've read it have been inspired to contribute back to you and say, did you know about this aspect of James Tate's life, or the people in his community? Has there been a two-way flow starting to happen from that?
I've had wonderful feedback. I have had letters at the rate of about 2 a day
Wow.
from since it came out. The most satisfying thing for me is hearing that someone's read it from start to finish, and I can often tell where they are, or whether they have. And I've had people say that they feel sad when they finish, that they didn't want it to end. So I've had that kind of, and I've had great feedback from the Indigenous communities. I had, one woman in Lytton who told me she had read it twice. And so from the Indigenous readers, it just really means a lot. But I have had lots of just great feedback. Yeah.
Deservedly so. Here's a question from Emma Kwan, our newest council member. Such an inspiring talk, Wendy. Thank you. Do you envision that more history programs will add public history programs or courses more focused in that direction? And how can I, as a university student, help to bring more light to this?
I think public history is just exploding right now. I think the university history departments see it as a niche. So this might be a very good opportunity for your organization to sort of put up your hands and say, well, if you're moving in that direction, pay attention to us. And we have some projects for you. We have some advice for you. I mean, they're cropping up across the country, which because I was asked to give this talk, and to be frank, I hadn't given it much thought, but I have spent the last month really thinking lots about it. And I think that there's huge growth right now, and obviously with their students, they're going to be getting this, it's got a community focus. I can only feel really quite excited about it. And the university itself sees it as kind of a monetary gain. So that to me is really quite encouraging. And I think the students are going to get something that they can take outward more. Yeah, I don't know. It'll be interesting to watch. It's just happening now.
Emma, thanks for the question. Jack Bryden at the Victoria Historical Society has a very timely question. Does public history have to be through a book? UVic has hosted many public forums about controversial statuary, which you referenced. Hundreds of members of the public showed up. They were hungry for discussion. Is that another way to merge the two?
Very good point, because totally not just the book. And I think the public history programs are going to be doing far more, documentary film and debate and, training students of writing policy. And I think all this commemoration stuff, there's a whole, when I was Googling around looking for stuff, I found at the University of Manitoba, a historian department doing a whole course on the politics of commemoration. So commemoration is really getting a lot of buzz, local history and public history, a lot of buzz. Definitely not just books. I actually think I feel in a way books are the old model. They take a long time. Are they really worth it when you can get the word out in so many other dynamic ways? For local historical societies like so many of yours, just these wonderful websites that go in every direction, and you can get the primary documents and the photo links to everything, the letters, everything. That to me is very, very exciting. And as Jennifer said, Bennell, at York, she said just the stuff that they're doing on mapping. It's very exciting. So books, I mentioned books, and I sort of focused on books because I'm old and I just did this book. But I actually am sort of thinking, books are, I'm older, books are a thing of the past. Young people are even doing theses and graduate work. I would say, if you can stay away from the book.
They'll beat you to it on Twitter. Here's another question from Andrea. I have to scroll back. A great talk. Where does memoir fall into this? Memoir doesn't tend to have a thesis in the academic sense. Can you merge memoir with a fact-checked piece?
Well, that's very interesting. And memoir is huge right now in the trade world. It's just the genre. Everybody's writing, stories about their lives. one of the things I found very interesting about Kate Brown, who I mentioned, who really feels that we have to write history that speaks. We maybe should be training our graduate students more in creative writing so that they can really learn how to communicate through writing, if writing is their medium, and still sort of is in the university. And she really says, don't be afraid of inserting yourself, of using the first, and Helen Sword, this other one that I mentioned who's writing on style, don't be afraid to insert yourself, to convey to your audience something about you and your research path and what you got there. And I did experiment with that in my last book. I mean, way beyond what most traditional historians would do in terms of placing themselves in their story, in this biography. So memoir, in a way, I've done a bit of memoir in that book. To me, maybe because of my age too, there's a whole path that I followed to get to that final point, and I couldn't figure out how to do it without leaving. I mean, in the old days, you left yourself out entirely. I mean, I find myself running to acknowledgments because in a lot of these books, it's the only place you could sort of get the personal touch. Who is this person? Where do they come from? What are the connections? And memoir is becoming a part of the new history writing. Yeah.
We have a comment from Maurice, and then a last question, I think, from Tammy. And Jane is going to draw a name for At the Bridge. Are you in your third printing now of that book?
I think we're in the fifth.
Fifth, wow, I'm way behind. Congratulations, that's fantastic. Maurice Gibbard says that I found that storytelling has been a very effective way for me to pass on history, and that it's well received and easily digested by my audience. Yet storytelling remains downplayed in academia. I appreciate Wendy's comments on this. I think he'd like to hear from you too.
Oh, okay. I am totally with you on that one. And really, if you want to get endorsement of that, I really recommend this book by Helen Sword, and it's called Stylish Academic Writing, and it's just really so much about storytelling, that basically we've all got these amazing stories to tell, and let's not bury them. I mean, run with them and stay awake at night dreaming about how you really can tell that story in a way that an audience is going to receive it, and not embellish and not go overboard or play too much, to go too far with your sources, but stick to the sources. But how can you stick to your sources and yet get that story out? The storytelling element to me is absolutely key.
Great question and comment, Maurice. Tammy Quiring from Aldergrove Heritage, they have some young universities history students in their membership, and she's wondering if you have any advice for that generation going in now. What would be your number one piece of advice for them as they begin researching and writing historic articles and books, etc.?
Well, this will sound weird, but I would say sit in on a creative writing course. Just how do the writers who really know that craft, how do they do it? Join in on some of their workshops. And really, if I were doing it all over again, I would definitely be working on my writing. Just if writing is your thing. But I'm also telling lots of graduate students these days, books are so hard, writing is so hard. In some ways, these huge documentary film projects and these huge website mapping, the digital thing is also a very exciting way to go. It's more the wave of the future. I worry about the book to a certain extent. If it's going to be the book, I would say work on your writing, and also find just the most dynamic program, open minded, just the most dynamic people to work with. And I would say public history. I mean, I want to drop the term, but the new public history programs are very exciting in terms of employment niches too. Yeah, so I think you're probably, a lot of your historical societies are going to benefit from some of these programs, and these students in their programs. Surely they're going to be looking at what you're all doing and running with them. Yeah, I mean, there's nothing like the local museums. I really want to get that point out. All the local museums across this province, they are, to me, just golden nuggets. You've got to keep them going. They are just so special. It's the first go-to place for me, but for anybody. And the people involved are so passionate about their communities. I mean, I just so appreciate what your organization does to support them and to keep that going. And I'd love to see the Ivory Tower open up a little bit more, quite honestly. And that's why in my talk, I guess I've been a bit hard on it.
I'll put a sunroof on it. Okay. I'm told by Andrea that students also can write for British Columbia History Magazine, of course,
Yes.
and also enter the scholarship competition, where Doug Brigham is working hard to get the word out to all of the history departments in British Columbia, and it's improving year over year, the entries we're receiving, or submissions we're receiving. So Jane is going to draw the name and announce the winner of Wendy Wickwire's book, At the Bridge, James Tate and an Anthropology of Belonging. And Wendy and I had a chat like this about the book, which you'll find on our webpage as well. It's a fascinating account of a man who was truly ahead of his time more than 100 years ago in terms of building bridges with the Indigenous community. Maurice says, Wendy, your enthusiasm in this regard has got to be contagious in academe. Thanks for your voice in this. And he's absolutely right. So thanks, Wendy. And I think we're doing the draw. Probably Jane has the magic bowl on her head right now and is dipping in to reach out a name. And Shannon is going to come back and conclude our meeting after we get the name of the winner. Are you going to be doing, sorry, is somebody speaking?
No, go ahead, finish up.
No, we're good, Jane. Announce the winner.
The winner is Mike Husco of the BC Dairy Historical Society. A worthy recipient.
You're
Good.
here.
Now we just have to figure out how to get a signed copy to him.
Excellent.
So we can work out that detail.
We'll get his address for you.
Good.
Thanks so much, Wendy.
Thank you, Mark. Nice to see you. And I saw Michael Cluckner there a little while ago. Hello to Michael. And Pat Roy, I saw I didn't see her image, so I've seen some people that I know well. So
yes, and Michael's up next. In terms of our video discussions. He'll be talking about vanishing British Columbia. So that's coming soon.
Oh, well.
Shannon, back to you to conclude.
Yes, I just want to thank Wendy so much for taking time out of your Saturday evening to talk to us, and we hope to hear more from you and read your books and get this discussion on public history continuing. So thank you on behalf of this Federation.
Thank you very much, and I have to say I love your magazine.